Over the next 3 days, we here at the TCO studios will analyze some pressing Minnesota Vikings offseason needs and scenarios. I'm Paul Allen. We welcome you to the TCO studios, and we welcome Courtney Cronin from ESPN and ESPN.com. She covers the Minnesota Vikings, and from a news standpoint, the Vikings currently are sans an offensive and defensive coordinator. So let's begin from an offensive standpoint. What's so important about the next coordinator here?
Well, look at what they built last offseason, Paul. They tore everything basically down to the studs. They brought Gary Kubiak and a bunch of the coaches that he's worked with throughout his career into Minnesota with Kevin Stefanski. They melded philosophies and they built something around Kirk Cousins to bring out the best in the Vikings quarterback. Now, it was a run-first scheme that featured heavy usage with Dalvin Cook, but that set Kirk up to bring out the best of Kirk. I remember asking Mike Zimmer about that at his season-ending press conference. What'd you think of how he played this year? And he said that this might have been the best year of his career, and statistically it was. So the importance of finding an offensive coordinator is keeping that continuity around the quarterback, around the offense, so these guys don't have to start all the way over again when they come back in April for OTAs.
Now, when it comes to the way it worked last year, 2019, Kevin Stefanski, offensive coordinator, now head coach of the Cleveland Browns. The man I called the amplification coordinator, Gary Kubiak, with run game coordinator Rick Dennison, also offensive line coach, and some brainy coaches all throughout the staff. At the end of the equation, how important was that mesh with everybody complementing each other?
Well, I think it was huge. And the fact is, this was very much a complementary scheme, and it was a complementary offensive staff. Like the staff itself, it wasn't this is my offense or I'm running this scheme. It was Gary Kubiak was brought in here to oversee the entire offense. Now, did he bring his zone scheme with him? Yes, and he's able to see it through now. But Kevin Stefanski, when he was here, 14 seasons, which is entirely rare in the NFL, he was under 3 different coaching staffs, and he worked with a lot of different offensive minds. So he had all these West Coast principles that both he and Gary were kind of able to meld into what they called the Minnesota Vikings offense. It wasn't Kevin Stefanski's offense. It wasn't Gary Kubiak's offense. It was a collective effort. And at least in my experience covering the NFL and people I've spoken with, hearing that much of no egos, being able to kind of keep this thing in-house, saying this is ours as a group effort, that's kind of rare. So in order to sustain that and keep that continuity going forward, it makes sense that you'd want to look internally first to try to find somebody else to pick up where Kevin left off in that sense and continue this thing going forward.
Now, I would think the defensive coordinator situation and or post is dramatically different than what we just discussed, because the head coach traditionally calls the defensive plays during the game. That, of course, being Mike Zimmer. So with the defensive coordinator post, as of now, still open, what's the importance of that role for this team?
Going into Mike Zimmer's 7th year, I'd question, does he still want to call plays at this point? Now, there are candidates that you could look at internally, potentially his son, Adam Zimmer, potentially Andre Patterson, who's been with him multiple stops throughout his career, where you keep that same continuity of Zimmer's scheme, but it might just be somebody else calling the plays. Now, that's obviously a decision that might come down the line and still have time, because he's talked about maybe I'll pass off the play calling duties at some point, and he just hasn't yet.
Right.
But I think for a defense that regressed in certain spots, I mean, you had players who were getting up there in age, and Mike Zimmer even said it is post-season press conference that this is a young man's game. So there might be some tough decisions of players they have to move on from and kind of bringing these younger guys along, of maintaining that same system. I think hearing the same voices that these guys had heard last year and even the years past is a true benefit to where this defense can go from here on out.
Now with Mike Zimmer, I truly believe he made several good decisions this year, but near the end of the season, a couple of very important decisions, and one that we know worked, and the other one I believe was the right decision. What I'm getting at was sitting the better players in that Bears game. We saw the pop and the vigor and the zest in the game against New Orleans. Then they have a short week off an emotional win against the 1 seed and they lose. So that decision I felt was brilliant. Now, talk about the importance of the decision he made this week to, instead of evaluating players right after the season, which they generally do and a lot of teams do, at his season closing presser, Mike said, we don't want to over-analyze or evaluate what just happened to us. So let's everybody take a little time off. Then we come back and rebuild.
Yeah, entering his 7th offseason, this is the first time that he's let coaches go for the week, and he's going to get some time off too. And I think that is probably the most cerebral thing you can do, just from a sense of it's grind, 24/7 from about July till, if you're lucky, February. Now, they ended short of their goal, but these coaches, these players, the front office, the scouts, everybody has been going nonstop. So I think a little bit of time away before you dive right back into free agency and trying to figure out which players you want on your team, which players you don't, which players you want to go after. Everybody needs a mental break. And, when you're trying to turn the page to the 2020 offseason and figure out who your offensive coordinator is going to be, who your defensive coordinator is going to be, and then going into which players do we want a part of this team next year, taking a little bit of time away from it to kind of digest what just happened and not make an emotional reaction. I think that's what Zimmer was saying on Monday, that he just doesn't want to go in and say, okay, let's react based on what just happened 48 hours ago. That's probably the smartest thing you could do.
In closing, with that 49ers game, we mentioned the short week off the dramatic overtime win against New Orleans, and San Francisco's good, had time off. It's a 1 seed. Why do you feel it ended with the thud that it did?
Well, let's start at the top. The 49ers are a really good team. They got the 1 seed for a reason. They had a fantastic front seven defensively. That was going to be a tough test regardless. But I do think some of the same issues that popped up in both games against Green Bay, against the Chiefs, against Seattle, against really good teams. That's the bottom line here. Those things happened in San Francisco in the divisional playoffs. Now, the offensive line, that's been a constant thing that you and I have talked about the last few years. That was a concern, and that's something that kind of reared its head in that San Francisco game. The version of Kirk Cousins that we saw against the 49ers was not the same Kirk Cousins that we saw in New Orleans. So there was a little bit of regression there too, I think, just coming off that high of that overtime drive that he led in the Superdome, to where they fell short and they weren't able to get a screen game going. They weren't able to get the run game going, and they were just kind of taken out offensively from the jump. Those were some of the concerns that I figured could happen, because you've seen the highest of highs when this scheme is performing at its best. But when you can't get the run game going and you are a run-first team and that's your mentality, you're going to struggle. So I think it really leads to a very linear path here in the offseason, that they know what they need to do. They have an incredibly talented roster. Age is a factor, especially on defense, so we might start to see some turnover there. But offensively, I agree with Mike Zimmer. I think they are a couple pieces away, particularly with the offensive line, in order to keep this thing going and not have to rip it up and start at the bottom.
And here at Vikings.com, beginning tomorrow, we will analyze offensive needs for the Vikings in the offseason, plus much more with Courtney Cronin from ESPN and ESPN.com. From the TCO studios, I'm Paul Allen. Thanks for watching.